Welcome to the Pharmacy Leaders Podcast with your host, Tony Guerra. The Pharmacy Leaders Podcast is a member of the Pharmacy Podcast Network, with interviews and advice on building your professional network, brand, and a purposeful second income from students, residents, and innovative professionals.
Welcome to the Pharmacy Leaders Podcast. Today I have a physician on who is a fellow podcaster. He is a physician podcaster at DoctorsUnbound.com. He's a consultant, an investor. He calls himself a perpetual student. He's an anesthesiologist by specialty, a graduate of the University of Southern California, and currently practices in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Dr. David Draghinas, welcome to the Pharmacy Leaders Podcast.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Great. Well, I wanted to start off with just a quick background. Everyone's leadership road is a little bit different. Tell us a little bit about where you've been and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. So I am currently a full-time practicing anesthesiologist, and I've always been interested in how technology, the rise of the internet, social platforms can impact healthcare and its delivery at a greater scale. So about 5 years ago, with a buddy of mine, we created a website called Anesthesia Myths. And the reason we did that is because we noticed that a certain subset of our patients came to the operating room just completely scared of anesthesia. And a lot of times, they'd been scared for days or weeks, getting on there, Googling information about anesthesia. And when I Googled myself, I found out that there was a lot of terrible and misleading information about anesthesia and anesthesia-related topics. So we created this website, Anesthesia Myths, to hopefully explain in simple language to people different topics about anesthesia and hopefully allay their fears a little bit. And building on that success, a more recent project is Doctors Unbound, which is a podcast where I get to talk to physicians doing amazing things out there, typically outside of clinical medicine. But my idea was to highlight physicians and really healthcare professionals. This can work for pharmacists, other healthcare professionals as well. But I wanted to connect with them. I wanted to learn from them. And I wanted to highlight all the awesome things that these healthcare professionals were doing out there to hopefully uplift the profession.
Okay, well, in a recent political interview, you actually spoke to a physician. I think this was actually your last episode on on Doctors Unbound, and we only have one pharmacist. We only have one pharmacist in Congress, all of Congress. Can you tell me a little bit about what he talked about in terms of being an outsider? How we, this staying, talking and doing this kinds of, I'd say advocacy is actually puts you as an outsider inside Washington.
Yeah, so that was Dr. Andy Harris, and I believe he's our only anesthesiologist in Congress. He represents a district in Maryland, and that's what Andy was saying, and what I agree with is we need more physicians, we need more pharmacists, healthcare professionals out there. It's kind of crazy that we're considered outsiders among Congress, but we actually need these people who understand how healthcare work to help, shape this policy that affects all of us, for patients and then obviously for the professionals as well. I think those interests are aligned.
Yeah, and a lot of your advice and the interviews that you do kind of fall into three categories. And what I wanted to do with this interview is kind of call attention to those categories and get some comments from you on the guests that you had.
Absolutely.
As I saw it, it was kind of purpose and family. Why do you make the money in the first place, and family always being first? And then, how do you make the money outside of maybe traditional professional roles, whether it's pharmacy or nursing or physician? And then we have many high income earners, but then it's keeping it. You have a number of your guests have kind of talked about how, sure, you're going to make X number of dollars, and maybe the student thinks, oh, well, it's going to all be okay. I've got 500,000 in loans, and it'll all be okay because I'm going to make $250,000 a year. But then we find out quickly how little they keep, and I think it's a little less than half, to be honest. So maybe we could start with organizing your time in life. The very first episode you did was why you are doing the podcast. And it's always good to kind of reflect and say, okay, well, why am I going to do this? Why am I going to take time out? So tell me a little bit about the frustrations that you've personally encountered with physicians and health professionals that made you put this extra peace in your life.
Yeah. So like I mentioned a little bit earlier, I've always been fascinated with the technology side. And, if you survey physicians out there, you see that there's growing frustration among the ranks. And I think this is multifactorial. Physicians are becoming more and more employees. We're losing a lot of our autonomy. That's part of it. The stress of the job, the long work hours of the job, that's part of it as well. So there's a lot of that kind of building up, and I wanted to connect with other physicians and highlight what they were doing, like you said, for all those different areas, create this community that we could all learn from these physicians out there that were doing pretty awesome things.
Okay, well, you went right to kind of talking about mindset after I think you were talking about a book that you had read, and that there's this kind of divide between the person who thinks, okay, well, I'm smart, I get good grades, but then the person who's the hard worker. And we're both parents, and I think you have 3 kids, is that right?
That's correct, yep.
Okay, so when your child does well, my understanding is that it's better to tell them, yes, your hard work led to that endpoint, rather than, wow, you're really a good basketball player, or you're really a good student. Can you talk a little bit about that kind of mindset?
Absolutely. So the book was called Mindset. I forget the subtitle, but it's by Carol Dweck. I believe she's out of Stanford now. And like you were saying, she really breaks down the difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. And the idea being that somebody with a fixed mindset believes that, there's sort of inborn talent, either you got it or you don't, and there's not much you can do to change it, versus somebody with a growth mindset that believes that, sure, there may be some talent there that we, we're blessed with, but we can drastically improve either areas based on our efforts. So I found myself very intentional, like you were mentioning with my kids, praising their effort, praising their creativity, praising hard work versus just saying, oh, you're so smart. Because they've done some studies with this, and they found that kids that believe, who are more in the growth mindset, when they encounter problems that they cannot immediately solve, they are much more likely to stick with it and work towards a solution. So, with something like entrepreneurship, right? Because what are entrepreneurs at their core? Really, they're problem solvers, right? So the ability to kind of stick with a problem, keep at it, be creative, come up with creative solutions that can work for everybody. Those are all growth mindset things. And that's what I'm trying to instill in my kids as well.
Well, when we, have our children, we want them to have great lives and careers that are satisfying to them. We might find ourselves with them saying, oh, hey, I got into medical school, or hey, I got into pharmacy school. But then you had an episode where you have burnout, and you talked to a physician who had kind of had enough of the bureaucracy, the administration, and all those things. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how you're seeing both sides of it, where, you've got these great expectations, and then some of those expectations maybe fall a little flat once you're in practice?
Right. So I think if somebody is experiencing some dissatisfaction in their career, and they're, considering something drastic like a career change, or they're experiencing burnout, something like that, I think the very first thing that's important is to drill down and really figure out what it is that's making them unhappy. Because sometimes it might be not that you're dissatisfied with your career choice. Maybe there's something specific. Maybe there's a specific part of your job that you don't like. Let's say you're an anesthesiologist. Maybe you really don't like to do cardiac cases, but you really like obstetric anesthesia. Now you can tailor your practice, hopefully, to eliminate the parts you don't like, keep the parts that you do like, and be happy that way. Or maybe it's a particular person or a particular, environment. Maybe it's a particular place that you work that is causing the unhappiness. So I think the very important thing to do is be honest with yourself, be able to do a little bit of searching and figure out exactly what it is that the problem is. Maybe it's something that you can adjust. And then by adjusting, you can continue in your career for a very long time with a lot of satisfaction and happiness, and only consider a career change if after doing kind of that really deep introspection, you find that, okay, this really isn't working for me.
Now, my understanding as a pharmacist, I don't necessarily know how medicine works, but in residency, there are certain specialties that are preferred over others, and to some extent, the hours are quote unquote better. I don't want to say they're good, but they're better. And my understanding is emergency medicine and anesthesiology are two of the better ones in terms of those kinds of hours. But how much does that factor in, and I guess, where do medical students, how much choice do they really have? And, once you've taken the USMLE, is it over? It's like, that's your score, that's your residency, or how much movement do they have? I just don't know as a pharmacist.
Sure. So there's a couple of things going on. Traditionally, the specialist or the subspecialist, if you will, the pay is better versus primary care. That's probably one big reason why, everybody talks about the primary care shortage. The way reimbursement happens, if you're a specialist, your pay is typically better. So that's one aspect of it. So that makes the special, and again, these are all generalizations.
Sure.
So that makes some specialties, especially surgical subspecialties, maybe a little bit more competitive, a little bit tougher to get into. So I think that's part of what you're you might be hinting at. Once so of course board scores becomes a part of it. Then you get on the interview trail, and that's a part of it. And once you get into a residency program, then it becomes, it's not impossible, but then it becomes quite a bit more difficult to switch residencies or to switch specialties. It does happen, but it's a little bit more difficult.
Okay. Well, you talk a lot about finances, or you interview a number of people who are specialists in finances and personal finance in a lot of cases. And episode 10, you talked about making a living or making a life, and this kind of also encompasses some of your other episodes. But I guess what I really want to know is, how much are student loans impacting decisions that students are making? I feel like if I had $400,000 in debt, and the quick math is to just double the amount of loan to know how much you're going to actually pay back. So they'll pay back about $750,000. How much does that impact a physician's choice of specialty? And do they maybe pick something they might not want as much, or because of this debt? Because it seems our average debt in pharmacy is $160. Mm-hmm. When I started hearing physician debt, I started appreciating that wasn't that bad. Quotation fingers.
So I think it definitely impacts people's choices of specialty, unfortunately. I think that's definitely the case. And as you just hinted, people getting into their medical training with that large amount of debt and then getting into a specialty maybe they've chosen for the wrong reason, and it's a competitive specialty and there's a lot of stress and you don't enjoy it, you can see how this can impact burnout and people feeling like they're stuck. Even though they're in a high paying field, because they've chosen maybe for the wrong reasons and are not enjoying it. And just to add my personal story, I went into medical school not knowing what specialty I would like. And I went to an expensive medical school. I went to a private school. I went to USC, fantastic school, fantastic clinical training, but it is a private school. And so I was going to have, quite the loans coming out. And even back then, I knew that I did not want money to impact my choice of specialty. So what I did is I chose to do a military scholarship. So I was in the U.S. Navy, paid back 3 years, 3.5 years in exchange for them paying for 3 years of my school. But one of the big reasons why I chose to go the military route was because I thought to myself, hey, what if I love pediatrics and pediatrics just isn't reimbursed as well? I want to be able to choose pediatrics and not worry about having these huge loans over my head that I won't be able to get out from under them.
Okay, and that kind of led me to episode 15, which is Who Wants to Be More Happy? But it sounds like really getting this financial piece in order? Is it more that what you're buying with being kind of mindful of the finances is some kind of, I guess, flexibility or more autonomy in a healthcare system that really is kind of taking a lot of the autonomy from us?
Yeah, I think the money part is a big part of it because of that. And what I like to tell people is that, wealth or money does not give you happiness, but a lack of money can certainly cause a lot of stress and unhappiness, unfortunately. So that's kind of how I look at it. So, money is a tool. Money is a tool that obviously buys us nice things to take care of ourselves, to take care of our loved ones. And just like you hinted at, it also can buy us freedom so that we can work on our terms, right? Maybe you want to dial back to part-time. Maybe you want to be able to have that confidence to go in and negotiate better. Say, you know what, I'm going to be working, this type of work, but not that other kind of work. So money, I think, if we are good stewards of our money, it allows us more freedom in all those senses.
Okay. Well, let's go on to some of the businesses and the side businesses that maybe turned into full-time jobs that you had on some of the interviews. Episode 2, you brought in a physician who I think she spent 5 years putting her book together or finally getting it out. But, having heard her story, what would your recommendation be to somebody who wanted to be an author? Would you go the self-published route, or would you recommend going through a traditional publisher?
So I think it depends on the purpose, or it depends on the person. I think many of us have writing a book on our bucket list. It's probably on my bucket list too, even though right now is not quite the right time for that. But I think basically what you got to do is you just got to do a little bit of research out there, and really understand, how much help you need and what's important to you. But what I really love is that in the environment that we are now, the major publishers for the longest time were the gatekeepers, right? So if you couldn't get a major publisher to sign on and publish your book, you were kind of done. That was the end of the story. And now having a self-publishing option is fantastic. And what you can do is, you can search online and find an editor. You can search online and find an agent. So you basically can go and seek out all of these pieces yourself and figure out some kind of option that is best for you. Maybe that's self-publishing. Maybe that's some kind of hybrid model. Maybe that's a traditional publisher. Some people still want to have the prestige of a traditional publisher. But I think what's great is that those gatekeepers have been removed. And if you think about it, you and I are sitting here on a podcast. And what is a podcast really? It's a radio station without the gatekeepers, right?
Sure.
So I love podcasting as a medium. That's why I got into it myself, because those traditional radio station gatekeepers have been removed, and we can talk about we can talk on a podcast here that is specific to pharmacists and those healthcare professionals, and we can have a great show about it. And I can do one for physicians, and I think that's just so awesome about the times that we live in.
Well, let's transition to another episode 5, where you interviewed someone with 6-figure medical writing. And my initial thought was going to be, this is somebody who works night and day writing. But if I remember right, she had about 40 writers, and she kind of created a company, and specialists kind of share the wealth. And I guess going back to my own life, where, if my wife asked me to do something, my initial thought is I have to do it. But what she really wants is she just wants it done. So when somebody asks for medical writing, they just want it done. So can you talk a little bit about what it's like or what, kind of tips she gave in terms of kind of starting that business and growing that business from she was doing the writing to kind of getting other people on board?
Right. So that was Emma Nichols, and she was a PhD, and she found out that she really didn't like academia. She really didn't like the bench research, but she really loved writing. And so her career, of course, transitioned. She started off first by, cutting her teeth, figuring out how to do the medical writing online, and growing that way. And eventually it, like you said, it turned into a business where she coaches others how to get into medical writing. And then she actually has a writing business where she can actually get the writing gigs, if you will, and pass them on to people within her company and her network. So if that's something that interests you, what I would do is, because I think pharmacists, like physicians, other people that are, higher income professionals, by the time we've gotten to where we are at, we tend to have a little bit more money and a little bit less time. And I'm the type of person where I'm willing to trade some money in order to get somebody to coach me up or mentor me up for whatever it is that I'm trying to learn. So I think with something like this, it's definitely worth going through, a coaching program or something where, you're not going to spend the hours, doing it wrong and trying to figure out how to do it. You're going to find somebody who knows the ropes, learn from them, and then you're going to be able to take off that career a lot quicker.
Well, tell me a little bit about startups. Episode 8 and 19. I don't want to put medical marijuana and healthcare startups together, but starting a business when you're already a busy professional, what recommendations do you have for maybe first steps? How do you start a startup when you have just a couple hours a day, if that?
Sure. So that episode with healthcare startups, what I really liked about that episode is that we were able to kind of de-glamorize, some of the romance and mystique around startups because it's, startups are kind of like the cool thing. They're the cool kid, right? Everybody is startup this, startup that. People are throwing millions and billions of dollars at startups. And the truth of the matter is, startups are just a lot of work. There's high failure rate, right? Because if you think about it, business is so cutthroat. The market doesn't care who you are. It's either gonna like your product or it's not. So I loved that it was able to kind of de-glamorize, some of the aspects of startups. But like you said, I think as physicians, if you're not going to completely do a career transition, I think the ways that physicians, pharmacists, other healthcare professionals can get involved is either by trading some knowledge, some sort of knowledge. What's the word I'm looking for? Advantage that they have. Let's say you're a pharmacist and you really know about some specific, drug product or particular drugs that are coming out. Now, you might be able to take that and leverage that into maybe some consulting work with a particular company, let's say a drug startup, or leverage that into a piece of equity or something like that. So I think that's where healthcare professionals can really do well, is leverage their personal experience, leverage their expertise into providing maybe either some kind of consulting and maybe even a piece of equity, so that they have a piece of that company, but they're not the ones who are running it full time. Because like we talked about earlier, if you're going to be the one running the startup, then that's a full-time gig and a half.
Okay. All right. Well, what about this medical marijuana practice? The opioid crisis, medical marijuana coming together at the same time. It seems like kind of a strange dichotomy, but tell me a little bit about this physician who has a medical marijuana practice.
So that episode was actually very interesting for me because, my background is that I'm pretty conservative. I grew up very conservative. So honestly, before I even decided to do the podcast and was thinking about actually publishing it, I had some reservations, but I said, you know what? Let me get out there. Let me listen to this physician and keep an open mind about things. So for me, that episode really kind of challenged, some of the things that, maybe were biases of mine towards marijuana, and specifically with regard to medical marijuana. I think if used appropriately under proper physician guidance, I see it as potentially another tool in the toolbox to help physicians care for patients because, like you were alluding to, the opioid crisis is a very real and devastating thing. I learned a ton about medical marijuana and just the different ways that, it can be consumed. So I learned a ton from that episode. But I think, again, it's something that, we have to proceed with caution.
Okay. Well, we've talked a little bit about family, a little bit about building businesses and some side businesses. Let's talk about keeping that money. Episode 4 was probably actually one of my favorites because he talked about the difference between financial independence and financial freedom. And I was really surprised at his two numbers. He said 25x was his financial independence number, but then I think his costs was only like $60,000 a year. So there's a couple pieces here. Can we start with what's the difference between financial freedom and independence?
Yeah, so I went back and I looked at, I believe that it was the episode with Physician on Fire, and I went back and looked at some of his definitions. And financial independence, I think, is the idea that you can replace your expenses, or you can cover your expenses with other sources of income without having to work. So whether that's investment income coming in, whether that's the interest that's coming off of your 401k and your investment accounts, etc. And I believe the way he defined financial freedom was covering his core spending plus 2 times his discretionary spending. So it's a little bit more there, but that gives you, a little bit more wiggle room. Let's say, as you grow older, your expensive, your things that you may want to spend on can potentially go up. But when I did the preparation and did that podcast, the thing that struck me is, as high income earners, we're always thinking about how much money we make and how do we replace the money that we make. But really, to be, financially independent, you have to replace the money that you're spending. So, if we can live in, I don't want to say necessarily frugal, but in a way where we're just not spending willy-nilly, you can get to that number a lot quicker. And I'll add this final piece. They've done some research on happiness, and I understand that happiness can be kind of a vague term, but apparently after about $75,000 a year of spending,
I've heard that number too. Yeah.
Your happiness doesn't really go up. So, a good number to shoot for, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. Well, many of us use real estate. Some of us were lucky enough to buy in 08 or 07, and some of us, bought way before that and have made wealth through real estate. You had somebody on about multifamily real estate. So I have my house and then one investment property, but can you tell us a little bit about what it is to have more than one property?
So I've got a couple pieces of real estate, and I'm not an expert on real estate, and you'll always hear the debate between multifamily and single family. And I think most people who are making the argument for multifamily are going to make the argument of scale, right? Because you have more doors under one roof, so you can achieve a lot of economies of scale in that method. The catch-22, if you will, is that in order to buy any significantly sized multifamily, you're going to need a lot of startup cash. So unless you're independently wealthy, which, certainly most doctors and probably most pharmacists are not, then you're probably going to be looking at some kind of a syndication deal where you're going to come in as an investor into a multifamily investment.
Okay. Well, tell me a little bit about financial education. So you've done a couple episodes, episode 11, episode 14, and I'd heard of the white coat investor. I'd read his book before, and I'd say, wow, that was, the famous guy you had on your podcast, but then you brought in a congressman. So I'm like, all right, well, I don't know which trumps which, no pun intended with the president. But what can we take away from the white coat investor or his kind of thoughts? Because my understanding, or when I was listening to the episode, was that he was kind of a little bit sick of the way that maybe some financial, and I'm not making a broad generalization here, but some of the financial professionals that he ran into were giving some what he called very bad advice, terrible advice, and that maybe some physicians are being taken advantage of because they might not keep a good track of, their spending and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about some of the best takeaways we can take from the white coat investor?
Yeah. So just like you said, and unfortunately, probably among pharmacists, just like among physicians, there's very little, if any, financial education in our medical training. And our medical training is so rigorous, right? And you end up not having any time for it. And just like White Coat Investor, the same thing happened to me as I was finishing my residency training. I realized that, hey, my pay is going to go up and I don't know too much about money and I need to start learning now. So, a financial advisor versus not, there are pluses and minuses to each one. But what I think is imperative is, nobody's ever going to have your best interest like you do, unfortunately. And it really is time well spent, even if you don't become an expert, is to really start your financial education. And sites like White Coat Investor, among the physician community, there's a couple more. There's Physician on Fire, Passive Income MD. A lot of these have come about because physicians really haven't had a lot of financial education, and these physicians have seen the need and are providing some of that education there. Now, I'll say one more thing about White Coat. He's starting a course. I think it's going to be starting soon. And one thing that I like, and I don't know if you've taken any courses, but one thing that I like about courses is that it gives you kind of an A to Z in one complete package. So, there are a lot of great blogs and websites out there where you can read a lot of free information on financial topics, and that's probably a good place to get started. But what I like about courses is that, you're going to get something kind of like soup to nuts in one, like if you just follow the course from beginning to end. So I know White Coat is starting something like that, and I am looking at potentially being an affiliate of that. And what I may do, it's not 100% yet, but what I may do is do the course myself, and I might create a little group and see if anybody wants to do it with me, and maybe we'll go through, lesson by lesson, because I know I've got, I still have stuff to learn too. So I think that'll be awesome.
No, that is awesome. And I guess the fear we have, well, I don't want to say fear, but maybe technology is kind of coming in, and where I don't want to say we were given the promise that, well, we'll always need pharmacists, we'll always need physicians, but my own experience with human-computer interaction and hearing about radiologists is that if you have two radiologists look at the same film, you're much more likely to make a correct diagnosis. But then now they have, I think, some AI or some kind of technology that can replace the second radiologist. But now there's the concern that, are they going to also replace the first radiologist? And you had someone on, you titled the episode Futureproof MD, but let's try to make it maybe Futureproof Health Professional. How can we make sure that technology doesn't nudge us out?
Sure, absolutely. And Futureproof MD himself was a radiologist.
Oh, okay.
So that was interesting. That's why I hit him up with that question. But I think regardless of whether you're a radiologist, a physician, a pharmacist, right? I think we all have to have the mindset of embracing technology. Embrace it, understand its limitations, and figure out how it can improve patient care. Because that's how we're going to be the consultants and the experts, right? I think if we fear it, if we try to keep it away, number one, that's not going to work. And number two, that's going to do a disservice to our patients. So I think what we have to do is just embrace it, become the experts at it. And then by doing that, yeah, maybe the way we practice our field is going to change, but that's okay. That's, I think, just the best way to handle it.
I'm going to go back to a prior episode just because this visual was so stuck in my head. But my understanding was there was like a 400-pound patient that was upside down or something like that in some of the new technology. And I didn't really understand that. Can you talk a little bit about how sometimes once a system gets a new technology and spends all this money on it, that now they kind of put a little pressure on the healthcare professionals to use it? I didn't know the technology, and I hadn't had a chance to look it up. But are there instances where maybe the technology comes in and it really isn't a good fit, but the establishment kind of says, "Well, we're going to use it. We bought it."
Sure. So the story you're alluding to was in the Burnout episode where the doctor that quit medicine.
Yeah.
And what happened was he was talking about a time when he was practicing when I'm sure everybody's heard of the Da Vinci robot by now, hopefully.
Okay, yeah.
So back when he was talking about the Da Vinci robot, surgery was very, very new. And when those surgeries are done, typically now we use them a lot for gynecologic surgeries or for prostate surgeries. The patients have to be placed in what's called steep Trendelenburg position, meaning steep head down position. So you can imagine a patient that has to be in a steep head down position, the physiology of that when you have a 400-pound patient. Now, sometimes you just can't do the surgery when the patient is that large because it affects the respiratory physiology too much. So what was really tough in Dr. Chris's situation was because the robot technology was so new, the surgeon was still learning how to use the robot. So a surgery that might take 2 hours was taking 8 hours.
Oh my gosh.
So as the anesthesiologist, we hang on every pulse ox beat, every heart rate, every blood pressure, it's like, so we hang on every one of those. So I think that's what made it so difficult for him, is because he was in an environment where apparently the surgeon and the hospital staff and everybody else was not aligned with, him trying to protect the patient and the patient interest. Now, fortunately for me, I can say that, the vast majority, if not all of the places where I work, not only is my anesthesia group supportive of me as as the patient advocate, but I would say, the surgeons that we work with understand our expertise and that we're there for the patient's best interest. And I'll have that, conversation with my surgeon, and we might put that patient in that steep head down position and we'll do a little test, and I can tell them, this is going to work or this is not going to work. And I've actually had a case where I had to tell the surgeon, this patient is not tolerating this, and we had to convert and adjust the surgery. So it's all about the practice environment, aligning everybody's interests, because come on, let's be honest. If that patient has a bad outcome, that's not good for the surgeon. That's not good for the hospital. And obviously, number one is we got to take care of the patient.
No, absolutely. A number of pharmacists are trying to work with physicians, but physicians are busy, pharmacists are busy. How have you guys in your practice, or how have you kind of gone interprofessional with maybe other practitioners, or kind of gone across lines from just the physician and so forth? Do you have any examples of that could maybe inform or help the pharmacists listening?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the tough things about medicine, because, medicine, even among physicians, is so siloed. You have this specialty, that specialty, and we don't see ourselves very much. And then, like you were saying, interprofessionally with pharmacists, that's even tougher. Pharmacists for us, we interact with them not on a daily basis, but it's important for us to act with them because, I use medicines all day, every day when I'm taking care of patients. So I think one thing that's helpful for us that work in the operative environment are working on systems that help with, let's say, drug shortages. For whatever reason, there's probably multiple of them, drug shortages in hospitals.
IV bag shortages right now.
Yes, even IV bag shortages. Yeah. So figuring out methods of communication, early advanced email systems or things like that, where, hey, we as anesthesiologists get early fair warning, from our, pharmacist colleagues. Hey, this is the stuff that is kind of not completely short yet, but, it's kind of, green light, yellow light, blue, green, red light sort of thing. So coming up with systems of communication to keep track of these shortages, I think that's huge. I actually crowdsourced this question in some of the physician groups, and a lot of physicians were very thankful for pharmacists because pharmacists, have a very specific knowledge base, can really help us. One person who is especially was working as a hospitalist in pediatrics was very thankful about the the expertise that pharmacists bring. But communication is a big one. One where people, how do I say this? where I think maybe our communication can be better as far as interacting with patients and giving patients advice on taking or not taking medicine versus keeping the physician in the loop, or perhaps talking to the physician first. And I don't know enough about, pharmacists and how, their typical practice works. But that was one thing that came up was, if you think a medicine that a physician has put a patient on is not good or needs to be adjusted or what have you, it would really help that physician if that's communicated to them, early on, I guess would be one way to put it.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Well, is there anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to talk about?
I think we covered a lot, and I want to thank you, because I don't know if anybody's done such a thorough job of going through the podcast that we have up so far. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak. I want to thank everybody who's listening out there. Pharmacists are an integral part of the delivery of our healthcare. So, I've worked with pharmacists, and I continue, in my day-to-day practice as an anesthesiologist. So I want to thank them out there for all the hard work that they do. And if they're interested in checking out a podcast about, what doctors are doing out there, totally relevant, I think, to pharmacists too, they can check out Doctors Unbound. And if they want to reach me, they can certainly reach me through the podcast, and it's just doctorsunbound@gmail.com. I'm always happy to connect with listeners. I love doing that.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for being on the Pharmacy Leaders Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Support for this episode comes from Goodnight Pharmacology, 350 brand and generic name drugs with classifications, a leading resource for students in the United States, United Kingdom, and Australia. Print, ebook, and audiobook available on Audible, iTunes, and Amazon.com. Thank you for listening to the Pharmacy Leaders Podcast with your host, Tony Guerra. Be sure to share the show with the hashtag #PharmacyLeaders.